Sure.
Going.
Oh, I thought it was going. Okay.
Yeah, sorry about that.
Okay. Let me know when we're ready.
Okay, you can get going.
I'd like to welcome everyone to the July meeting of the Rules and Bylaws Committee of Community Board 8. I'm Chuck Warren, co-chairs of the committee, and have Tanya Barrero and Rebecca Dangor, my other co-chairs. And today we're going to try to see if we can come up with flesh out, to a certain extent, the procedures for the new elections committee that will run the electoral process for our election of officers, which obviously will start in September. And if we can work it right, we hope to get something out of the committee and have it voted on next week at the full board. And I think that sure we'll have a very vigorous and full discussion, and appreciate everybody who's making time to be here tonight. And I don't know whether if Tina and Rebecca want to make any comments before we get going.
Nope.
Yeah, I guess I would just say we need to come up with something to present to the full board in 2 weeks. So let's try and keep our comments shorter and more to the point for this meeting, because we really have to kind of create a new procedure, not completely from scratch, but from scratch. So, and I think we'll read some ideas that we had during our meetings in between the last full board vote, just as a starting point and a base of ideas. And then we'll be sharing a document with some other ideas that was written by Felice Barber, who's sorry that she can't make the meeting tonight, but we wanted to make sure to include her opinion. Tina, anything you want to add?
I just want to acknowledge that we're having this meeting on not an ideal evening or week. A lot of folks out of town for the holiday, and our local Congresswoman, Carolyn Maloney's having a gun violence town hall tonight that I know a lot of our colleagues are attending. And so similar to how Felice sent us her notes and her opinion, I think, like, well, if that's okay, I think maybe, after this meeting or tomorrow, we sort of acknowledge that, and send a note to the full board, allowing folks to send us their, whatever their commentary is in writing. I can already tell from the turnout that this is like a lower turnout for community board 8 members for this committee and this topic. And I think it's less a reflection of people's interest in the topic and more a reflection of the timing. So I just wanted to acknowledge that.
Why don't we get started? And Rebecca, there are a few questions that I think we wanted to get the committee's view on, and maybe, obviously we're going to have an elections committee, which will run the election process for the board officers. And the first thing to talk about is one of the things that is how many members should we have? We have obviously 7 members on the nominating committee, and there's some talk, do we need 7? Should we have maybe 5? And I think that's something that one of the things we ought to think about maybe first, and see if we can get a consensus on the committee as to whether we should keep the 7 members or we should go to 5. So why don't we throw that out to the committee?
Before we, I'll read kind of all of the ideas that we collected during our last conversation a little bit later, but just I think an important point to think about in terms of the number of members of an elections committee, which, remember, is not reporting a slate, but running the election and asking questions, is we have an idea that all board members would be able to submit questions for a certain office to the chair of the committee for consideration. We can decide if that's a good idea or not. We can also decide if they're mandated to ask those questions or if it is up to the discretion of the chair. But I think it's important to remember that this is not a committee that is making a decision. So the number of people should just really reflect kind of best practices, and maybe if we should consider whether or not, if this is going to be a little bit more intense of a process, whether having too many members might make it not work as well versus if having fewer members makes sense or not. All right, so I think we have some hands raised. Let's go to Michelle.
Yeah, excuse me. Thanks, Rebecca. I think for me, certainly, maybe not for others, but for me, I need all this defined. And I think people, maybe there's someone on who had voted for this election process that could tell us what they have in mind. What does this election committee do? How do they get to do it? How do they get appointed? So before we talk about how many there should be, I'd like to know what the entire process is here. The only process I know is the one we had. And to the extent that that's changing, I'd like to know what the new process is. So if we can start by answering those questions, who appoints this election committee? What is their described function? How do applicants apply and make their interest known? And once they do that, what's the process for them going forward? So I'd like to know all that before we talk about anything else.
Right,
Thanks.
that makes sense. I think what I should do is kind of raise a point.
Let me spell.
I think what would make sense is if I read kind of some of the points that we discussed just to give people an idea of what we were thinking about. Again, you can disagree with anything. You can come up with your own replacement idea. This is just like a brainstorming.
Well, Rebecca, before you do that, the board passed a resolution last time sort of laying out the general parameters of what the elections committee would do. And I think it's important to keep that in mind. Basically, just to answer Michelle's question, which I think is a very appropriate one, the elections committee will run the election process for board officers. They won't make any recommendations or report a slate. The members will be selected by the board, like we select the nominating committee at the September board meeting. Question of whether it's 5 or 7 we can talk about. And then the committee, either the committee or the board, again, an issue, will choose a chair. And then candidates who want to run for the various office will submit their candidacy to the board office and probably the chair of the elections committee, give them a couple of weeks to do that. And then the elections committee will interview all the candidates and will ask the candidates questions that are tailored to that particular office, and also can take suggestions from other board members if they want to make it, on the questions that are going to be asked. And then the answers will be provided to the board members. And that's the question of how that's going to happen, how that will be provided, I think is something that we'll get to. And then when you get to the reporting out, the report, get to October meeting, all the candidates will have been interviewed. And I think one of the issues is, should there be nominations from the floor? And if so, under what kind of a process? That's something to talk about. And then once you have sorted out who all the candidates are for the various offices, at the November meeting, there will be, again, run by the chair of the elections committee. There will be speeches by the various candidates, and then we'll vote. And so that's the general parameters of what the board agreed to. That's how the elections committee would function. And it's just a question of fleshing out some of the issues a little bit more. But that's how I would answer that question, Michelle.
So I think it would be worth, before we call on other people, to go through what we talked about during our call. Again, anyone can decide or come up with a better idea or disagree or agree with any of the kind of initial ideas we had in terms of structuring. They're also in no order. So I did mention, questions at large from board members that we discussed, board members being able to submit questions addressed to all candidates for a given office by sending the questions to the committee chair. The chair is not mandated to ensure these questions are asked by the committee, but are required to share all requests with the committee. In terms of nominations from the floor, we can either have none, or this is a process that we came up with in case some people wanted to hold on to that option, which is a candidate can be nominated from the floor in October, provided that they either attempt to have an interview with the committee by a certain date, or if unable, write verbal responses for the office they intend to run for. Remember, I think part of Craig's resolution is that every candidate for a given office will be asked the same questions. And in order, this came from other bylaws, in order for their nomination to be counted, they must receive 10 signatures from board members by 2 weeks or whatever date, if this is something we want to do, after the minutes of the election committee become public. Now let's think a little bit about minutes. A lot of the people on this call are chairs or co-chairs of committees and know that minutes can be brutal, and it is a daunting task to think about doing minutes for something like this. We discussed that issue and proposed for your commentary that the minutes will consist of the members of the elections committee, the names of all the candidates running for office, the questions, which must be the same again for each individual office asked by the candidates, and a link to a recording of each interview. We do have the OWL cameras that will enable us to do that. And that you will still automatically be ineligible to run for office from the floor in October if we decide to keep that, precaution, if you serve on the elections committee. And that the attendance record of all candidates running for office will also be submitted as part of the minutes. In terms of voting for the elections committee, we're open to any ideas, but we didn't really see a big need for it to change. Prior to nominating members to the committee from the floor and electing them to serve, all board members will receive a detailed record of each board member's service. All nominations must be accepted by the individual with the understanding that they cannot run for board office that year. We think it's worth speaking about continuing to prevent serving on that committee 2 years in a row. And that the committee will decide the chair of the elections committee during the September meeting, as is done with the nominating committee. And that also all chairs of any elections committee will receive a list of prior election committee chairs, maybe nominating committee from the past few years while we're starting something new, just so they have more of a resource than I think was given to chairs before. And that we also want to make sure we take the initiative to set a date, probably a weekday date, of when people have to send in applications to run for board office, because there was confusion about that during the last year. So that's something we want to make sure is included in any amendment to the bylaws. And then what Chuck said, our kind of other big idea was that maybe, we're not writing a resolution, we're writing an amendment. Maybe we should fully state that all questions must be tailored appropriately to the office in question in order to provide the board with the relevant information needed to vote on the position. I don't know, Taina or Chuck, do you have anything else to add from our conversation last night?
Nope.
Oh, actually, I did. If we decide to do recordings of interviews, it's very important. I think I said this, but I just want to stress it, that they will not be published until all candidates have been interviewed. I mean, people have complained about unfairness, and I think it would be unfair to get a look at what you're going to be asked before you're asked, if that's not the same for everyone else. I think we should turn it back to the public. Let's go to Gail.
Can we call?
I don't know whether Michelle had if you wanted to make a further comment, we were answering.
Yeah, I would like to
Michelle's.
call, there's a non-community board member, a member of the public that had his hand up, Boaz, if we could call on him first, please.
Thank you, Tina, that you give the spotlight to the public. I think should be the ethic of every board meeting, that first of all, let the public talk, and then the community board members can talk all day long. So I have a few items that I want to mention. One, I want you to consider that two minimum requirements for community board members. One is that every community board member during the election will have to bring some kind of signature from the public. At least, I don't know, decide some kind of a fair amount, I don't know, 50, 100 signature from the Upper East public that will demonstrate that there are people behind him. I think this is super important, that that the people that represent in the community board have actual people behind them. That's one. The second thing, I think that there should be a minimum requirement about participating in some kind of in some meetings before being elected, before trying to get elected to the community board. There are people that I know from from the meetings, and there are new members that got elected this year that I've never seen before. And so I think that they should have some kind of past experience. The third thing related, in my opinion, it's related. Last week there was an election for the New York State Assembly. I was very disappointed that I haven't seen the entire community board rally behind Russell. I think that this is, you guys had an option
I'm sorry,
to have
I don't mean to cut you off,
behind.
We're not allowed to talk about politics, but I really appreciate you coming. It's nothing against you. It's just a rule that we have. If you have other ideas for the committee, feel free to raise your hand. We just can't talk about political elections during board meetings. I do know that Judy Schneider has a point of information, so we're just going to break the order to allow her to ask that clarifying point, and then we'll continue with Gail.
Yes, I may be confused. Chuck made a comment and then you made the same comment. At the last meeting, when this was approved by the board, I thought that the resolution that was approved, that anyone who wanted to run for the board had to run for the board and submit their name to the committee by whatever the date or time or however that is, and that there would be no nominations from the floor. Has my brain gone stale? Do I remember the
That
meeting?
that was an issue. I don't think that was it. Yes, that was what we talked about doing.
But I think that was part of the resolution at the time, that there would be no nominations from the floor. Everybody had to put in their names if they wanted to run prior to the committee interviewing people. And I don't believe that people were allowed to put in their names after that, because we had quite a discussion that if people did afterwards, they wouldn't be interviewed. They wouldn't be asked the same questions everybody asked. So it wouldn't be a level playing field. At least that's my recollection of the meeting.
I think that's a fair point, and we can, as a committee, vote to not include that. We just spent time thinking about it and wanted to at least present an option that would account for that issue that you described.
Yes,
I think
but
it's really,
I think we voted on that, Rebecca, and I don't think we can go back on what the full board voted on. I don't
think
know,
what we
maybe
can
Will
do-
can
I
look at,
think what we
maybe
we
Will
can
can look
do-
at the resolution and see if it covers that. I don't know whether the resolution did. I don't have it handy. If anyone has it handy, maybe they can comment on it, but I think we need to know that before we go any further.
Well, we're also, that was a resolution, and what we're voting on tonight are amendments to the actual bylaws. So, you know, we don't have to keep talking about this issue if there's enough people who want to ensure there's a way for people to be nominated. We can address that a little bit later, but essentially we're going to be presenting textual changes, and we'll definitely take your notes. So if there is a majority of people on the board, in the committee tonight who don't think it's appropriate to address that, I think we can just have that as a separate amendment, and it can be voted down without jeopardizing the integrity of kind of the process of the rest of the process of the committee.
Judy, for the record, I just looked at, we'll put a link in there about the minutes from the June meeting. And there wasn't any specific in the resolution that was adopted, I think, but I think you're correct in that the discussion was that it probably made sense to have nominations from, or it wasn't written into the resolution that was passed by the board. And so that's something we could still discuss. I mean, I think there are pros and cons, you know, about that. And I think that's something we can flesh out. And the idea was, that was sort of a generalized resolution that this meeting, we would try to flesh out some of those particulars.
All right, let's go to Gail.
I think Judy tried to hint you back, but I guess she's muted.
Yeah, I think we have to start to think in terms of how we simplify versus complicate the entire process. And we have two choices when it comes to the committee. Number one, we can have the committee appointed by the chair, as is the case with other committees. Or I think, given all of the concerns that have been raised in the past, have the committee members nominated by the entire board. And I would think that given the role of the elections committee in many of the other community boards, they don't do the interview of the committee members in the way that the nominating committee of the potential applicants, in the way that the nominating committee has done in the past. They look to see if there's any reason why a person should not be able to stand for a particular office. For example, if someone hasn't come to a meeting for several months, are they ill? Is there a reason that they haven't really fully participated? And if they are elected, will they agree to serve? So I think that having the interviews kind of akin to what the nominating committee currently does may not be the appropriate move if we're looking to be more open. Somebody says, I'm interested in running for office X. By such and such a date, that application for running for that office has to go to Will in the board office. Then the committee will look at what questions will be asked, but I think those questions should be asked in front of the full board, not just, it just complicates things if the committee then does the interviewing, then you record what's said. If you have it just out in the open, one meeting, maybe the full board meeting, depending on how many applicants there are for different positions. But that way they could certainly vet the questions, definitely make sure that every candidate is asked the same questions. That is fair, and it's done in front of the entire board. And I think that that was the concern about transparency. And it makes the role of the committee more expediting running the election, ensuring that there are reminders sent out so that people do know what date they have to get their application in and all. But I don't think that we have to have the committee start to interview all the applicants, then record those interviews. I think what they should get from every applicant is their CV or bio, so that people have some background information, but they actually hear what the potential candidate has to say at one meeting. And I think that seems to be what a lot of the other boards do. Some of them do not have pre-prepared questions. They're questions from the floor. But I like the idea of having the prepared questions for the candidates, because that way you know that you get everybody's answer about the same question when they're running for a particular office. But I don't think that we have to kind of try to parallel what we're doing with the current nominating committee as far as getting into more intense questions and kind of then having some people feel, well, wait a second, how were those questions posed? That way everybody has heard the same thing at the same time. And I think it just makes it a little bit cleaner and ultimately easier for the board and for the elections committee. Now, I do know that on some of the community boards, they will go ahead and they'll have the CVs of the people who are planning to run for office. Nobody has been interviewed yet, but when they come up with the list of people running for each office, they do have nominations from the floor, just in case there is anyone who didn't was out of town on business, whatever the case might be. So that way nobody can ever say so-and-so for whatever reason wasn't able to run. And then by the next day or the day after, that person's CV also has to be sent out to the full board. Then at the meeting when everybody is interviewed, it's just clean. And a lot of them have separate meetings that are just covering the candidates and the elections. And that might be a little bit easier than trying to fit it all into a full board meeting. Those are my thoughts to date.
Gail.
Yes.
If you read the resolution that was passed, did have the committee asking the questions. And I think one of the problems is that you don't.
Well, they can ask the questions, right,
No,
Chuck?
No, I understand, but
yeah.
have the committee ask it. But
Right.
And I think the idea is to not take up that much. You'd have to maybe have it if you want to do it the way you talked about it and have it done at a board meeting like that. I mean, you'd have to have another board meeting just for elections and stuff besides the meeting, where you vote on things. And I think it gets to be, I think the feeling was it's too cumbersome to do that. So I think that's why I think the system that the board had specified in the resolution, having the committee ask the questions and letting everybody see the questions.
I agree with you.
Makes the most sense.
As far as having the committee ask the question is, do the questions have to be asked by the committee prior to the meeting, or are they asked by the committee at the meeting with all the candidates after they've spoken or before they've spoken?
But that's,
I
Again,
apologize.
I think it's a question of the time.
Craig proposed a resolution. He couldn't make it tonight, but I do believe his intention was to ensure all candidates were asked the same questions, and that it would not get in the way of the public time that we're supposed to give to them during a full board meeting. But that, of course, he wanted all of the answers to be widely shared to the board.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's fine. Yeah, my whole thing is as long as you've got the questions, the same questions, and indeed that would be the role of the elections committee. However we decide it takes place is up to the group at large. Yeah.
Right.
And of course, we'll have
you.
to decide whether or not if we want to have board members submit questions to the committee, whether or not they're mandated to answer them. That's something you guys have to come up, decide together. Let's go to Alita.
Thank you. I just first want to point out to Boaz that the board is appointed by the borough president and the city council members, not elected by other board members. And it's a very lengthy and detailed application. But having said all of that, moving on to the nominating committee, I believe that the election committee should be nominated from the floor in the same mechanism that we have nominated members of the nominating committee. That makes it much fairer. Again, it removes authority or power solely to appoint people that may support you or your chosen candidates. So I think it's more fair, more transparent to have people nominated from the floor to be on that committee, who would then choose a chair. I think an odd number of people is good, maybe 5 people. You're right, Michelle was right, since they're not approving or vetting the candidates. I don't think we need as many members necessarily. they are asking the questions. I think as long as it's recorded and minutes summarizing or even just writing down what the minute taker thinks has been said is not necessarily fair or transparent. I know from writing contracts how much language matters. So it should be the language of the candidates, and it should all be recorded and submitted. And after the October meeting, maybe when people have had the chance to be nominated from the floor, because they shouldn't be able to bypass any of the mechanisms that are set forth for the elections committee. All of the questions should be the same as in the resolution. And I am a little concerned about the mechanism to select questions. If every board member has one question for each candidate, that's 40, 50 questions. That's a lot of time. So there should be an approval process, which is why an odd number of committee members makes sense. And then they choose the questions, and there should be an opportunity for candidates to be able to call and talk to people if they want to, if anyone has a specific question. But in terms of all of the information provided to the board members, it should be standard and it should be approved, and that would avoid duplicative or unpleasant questions designed to embarrass someone or favor somebody. In terms of, and that could be done all at the at meetings of the election committee. It certainly would be a much longer time commitment than the nominating committee has had, along with providing the CV or the resume to full board members, if the idea is to make it transparent. Board members should have an opportunity to submit questions, which then I think is, I don't want to be redundant, the committee members would select and ask all of the board members. And there should certainly be a time limit on the answers, and they should be confidential until everyone who's running for a particular office has had the opportunity to answer those questions. And that's why after the October meeting makes sense, so that it would be the same questions, even if someone's nominated from the floor. I'm not sure I agree, and I don't remember this being in the resolution that 10 people from the board need to approve each.
No, that wasn't in the
Okay.
resolution. That wasn't.
Okay.
It was just, we were thinking about if, people were concerned about losing that opportunity to run for office based on the candidates on the table during a given year. If that was something people were concerned about not being able to continue to do, we wanted to try and come up with a solution that would still be reflective of what the board spoke about before.
I think that would cut against, maybe certainly for chair, someone should be running who knows the people on the board or has had an opportunity to be part of a lot of board meetings. But for secretary, I think, as you may have pointed out, Rebecca, new members should be able to participate in that and be elected to be secretary. And especially with Zoom, right now, the opportunity for new members to know 10 people and be able to solicit signatures, I think, would be a difficult task. So I'm not sure that I would be in favor of that. And I think that that's about it. And just the recording should be available, no editing. And maybe when you send out recordings, you could send out the number, whatever that video references to where particular interviews begin. And the question should be asked in the same order and for the same amount of time for everyone running for a particular office. And the amount of time should be limited as well, as we do here for public speakers. Thanks very much, you guys. And I know how hard you're working on this, so thank you.
Thanks, Alita. And I just want to comment on that last point you made. I think it's a fair one. I think we were really trying to be responsive to the various perspectives that were shared by our colleagues, and there just were a lot of concerns about creating a process where somebody couldn't just nominate from the floor or be nominated from the floor. And so, what Rebecca read before, I think, was a little bit of a happy medium where it's yes, that is possible, but you have to have, the support of 10 board members. So it was our effort to.
Well, you're just talking about people being nominated from the floor.
Yeah.
Even so, I would think that fewer would be better, but anyone nominated from the floor should have to go through the same process that every other candidate does, because that's
what I read in the thing. It's either, we have to also remember this is everyone's second job. So we were just trying to come up with a situation that would work for everyone's busy schedules. We included, for your guys' debate, if they could try and get an interview, right? If we're going to decide all other candidates who apply, submit their names in advance are going to be interviewed instead of submitting written responses. And that in the case that they're unable to get an interview, because again, the elections are in November, I don't know everyone's calendar, we got to come up with a solution that will stand the test of time, that they could write written remarks, right? But someone could argue that that might not be fair. So then we wanted to just, as an idea based on what we saw in other bylaws, offer that as an addition. We can decide to reject it or not, but I think that's up to the purview of the committee. And I will also say that anyone can offer a bylaws amendment at any time that's specifically about kind of the electing of the elections committee, because I'm not sure if we're going to have a lot of back and forth on that. So if someone wants to do that in the future, at least so that we kind of get started on figuring out what we're doing, that would be welcome.
Okay, I just have one more point, which now I think I've forgotten based on what you were saying. Oh, maybe you don't need all the 5 members to be there for every interview. Maybe if you have the chair plus 2 or 3 members, that will make it much easier to schedule, because everyone by all means should be subjected to the same process, whether they're nominated from the floor. I also wonder, since there is no vetting by the elections committee, why people would want to be nominated from the floor. So my question is, will the full board know who has been interviewed by the committee before October, even if we don't know what the questions and the answers are, so that people could see who's right?
Yes, sorry if that wasn't clear. I believe, and again, I don't know why I said that, because we haven't decided anything, but what we thought was they would submit minutes, right? That includes all the names of people who are running. And again, this is just like theoretical. Let's say someone is really unhappy with the 2 candidates running for chair. Maybe we need to provide, or maybe the whole board is, we don't know what could happen, especially with term limits in the future. We wanted to at least provide an ability maybe for someone to respond to certain candidates. It's not the biggest issue we have to solve tonight, but we wanted to at least think of an alternative to meet those concerns expressed by certain people before.
Yeah, and I think just to add to that, and then I want to, if we can go to Michelle next. I think, Alita, we were also trying to think of, and I don't want to say it's sort of the exception, but we're really trying to, we've all spent, in my opinion, far too many hours and energy of our lives on this for like an internal election process for a local community board. However, so if we're going to do it, let's actually do this in a way that is going to address any potential scenarios, right? So in addition to what Rebecca said, a scenario where somebody, because the window of time is so small, right? So a scenario where somebody's on maternity leave or paternity leave or had a major surgery, or for some or whatever reason just was not able to participate in the limited scheduling process in a very short window of time, right? That we allow for an opportunity for someone to actually to run, to be a candidate, right? With some vouching from other board members. I think that was the spirit. That was the spirit
Okay.
of what we were approaching.
Okay.
Or even theoretically, maybe only one person ran to be secretary. I can testify to the fact that we definitely need more than one. I'm very grateful that our bylaws allow for 3, but there's got to be a way to make that up if this is going to be a committee that doesn't make decisions. So we just wanted to try and come up with something to show you guys to account for further potential issues. Let's go
Thank
to.
Thank you.
Go to Michelle.
Yeah, thank you. Okay, I have a little bit of a different take on this, and I also support what Judy said. If the fact that we had 3 options that we voted on, and one of them was when we decided on the elections committee, the proviso was that there was no nomination from the floor. That was definitely in the resolution. If it wasn't translated into the written resolution, I think that's an error on the written resolution. I'm happy because I didn't want that anyway. But if you're going, as Warner Wolf says, go to the videotape, go to the audio tape. That was one of the parameters, that if you wanted an election committee, there were no nominations from the floor. So how you're planning to resolve that, I would go to the tape to make sure that you have this correct, because it's certainly not impossible that the transcription, wasn't accurate. But having said that, I don't see any reason for interviews by a select committee when the select committee is not putting forth a slate and has no additional powers over validating or supporting a candidate. There's no reason to have an interview. What I would suggest, since you're bent on questions, and you don't know how many applicants you would get, and you don't know how many people from the general board would like to submit questions, what I would suggest is that you ask the board if anybody would like to submit questions for the applicants. Please do so by thus such a date, send it into the office. You make all of the applicants aware of the questions that were submitted, and you let the applicants each choose 5 of the questions to answer for, whatever the amount is based on time. I think that tells you more than sitting and listening to 5 people answer the same question. They have different backgrounds, they have different interests. Everybody brings something different to their chairmanship. You will know more about an applicant by the questions that he or she chooses to answer and by the depth and breadth of that answer. And that takes the process of having to screen questions from 50 board members, and then you're going to put it in the hands of a committee of 5 to decide which of those questions, including their own, that they're going to now ask of all of these applicants. I think that if you did it this way, you would then have one full board meeting at which all of the applicants for each of the offices stood up and verbally answered their questions. And then the next meeting, you vote. But the way you're laying it out, to my mind, with all these different manifestations and maneuvers, you're going to go into way too many meetings. It's not a good spending of the time. The full board meets 11 times a year. And now we would take up 2 for election. The way you're talking, you'll be taking up 3 or maybe even 4. It's way
That's
too
not
many.
true.
Sorry,
That's not true.
I think you're
That's not
confused
true.
because what we had described, which was based on kind of the other elections committees that exist in community boards, was purposefully to avoid taking away from the public time or from the other business of the board. People can watch recordings if I hope everyone really cares about an election, but they don't have to watch it, right? It was finding a way to not take away time from the public. And maybe this is biased to say, I think that's very important. We shouldn't have 3-hour elections every November. But this would essentially, what we laid out was the same process in terms of, spending some time in September to elect an elections committee, spending time in October. I mean, they probably won't need to actually give a report during, the conduction of business, because it will just be minutes. They're not stating an opinion. I mean, I guess they could read all the people running for office, and then if people want to allow nominations from the floor, we could allow that, which is how we do it currently. In November, how we kind of structured it, and I believe Craig said this, Chuck, you can correct me if I'm wrong, he did not want questions asked by members of the board during the November meeting as part of his resolution. I don't remember. I will double check, but that it would strictly be people giving, a speech if they're running in a contested race, and then voting. So I don't think it would be
Yeah.
In
All
terms
right.
of time, public time, it would be
Okay,
different.
fine. Be that as it may, maybe it won't take more than the 2 we currently allot. That's great. But I just think that there's no reason to take the time for election committee interviews when they're not putting forth a slate, when you're suggesting that the entire board has to hear from all of the candidates. So that's a duplicative process. And I think that that could be cut. If they're just running the election, then their job is simply to send out deadlines to make sure that the candidate, the applicants, that the board office has the applicant's name for the position, that if you're calling for the full board to submit some questions, that the board has the questions. Not all 50 people will want to necessarily submit questions, but that is an option. But then if you're telling that the election committee now is picking the questions, that goes to the bias that you are also concerned about. So to me, I think it's perfectly fair for an applicant to want to show off his or her best attributes, highlight the best parts of their curriculum vitae. I don't think it's a negative or terrible thing if they pick the questions and you give them a number, however many, you think you have time for. You're going to set a time limit and let them answer those. And I think that tells you way more about an applicant than them standing there and in a row answering the same exact question, and then whoever goes first, the second person will beat that person to the answer to the question, and then the third person will incorporate the first two. I mean, I just think it's going to be a
And
repetitive
first of all,
mess.
wait a minute, Michelle, you have the process all wrong.
Well, that's
You're
what
not
I
in a
understood.
row.
Explain it
You
to me. Enlighten me.
No. You individually, like we do in the nominating committee, you'll interview them separately. So the other people aren't going to hear the answers that the first, if there are 3 candidates, you'll interview the 3 candidates separately, just like you do now.
But
in
the full
nominating
board
committee.
has to hear them all.
No,
According to what you,
no.
They'll be
well,
released
that was
in
what
the
was,
minutes.
that was
They'll
what
be
was
released in the
discussed and
minutes.
in the resolution.
No,
I mean,
no,
unless
no,
I heard a
no,
completely
no.
different thing.
No, you don't.
It
Look,
was what was discussed
minute.
at the last meeting, to my understanding, correct me if you
No.
have it wrong, was that everybody was going to hear the answers, that the full board was going to hear the answers to the questions. Is
Yeah,
that
and
correct?
Let me read.
we talked about this.
But Rebecca, just hold one second. Let me read the resolution for that. All persons who've been nominated shall be interviewed by the elections committee, and all candidates for each office shall be asked the same question. The minutes of the elections committee containing all the interviews shall be published after the elections committee has completed all interviews. And that's what we're talking about. That's the procedure that was voted on by the board. And so the committee would interview each candidate separately. And then when they're all together, and we were just talking about how the mechanism of how that gets to the board. That's all.
Yes, it's still not clear to me, Chuck. Say that again. The election committee is going to interview all of the applicants.
Correct.
And they are going to ask
separately,
and they're going to ask each of those applicants the same question.
The applicants for the same questions that pertain, to the chair, the vice chair.
To the
office. Correct.
I'm in the middle of okay, so after the election committee does that, and now they have the interviews for each of these people.
Right.
How then are you getting them, all of these people, in front of the full board? How are you getting them in front of the board?
So Chuck,
Well,
if you'll let me say this.
Go ahead, Rebecca, talk about.
So
Rebecca, you want
a little louder, Rebecca.
I think originally the idea was to have the chair of the elections committee be responsible for transcribing the answers from an interview. This is kind of unfeasible. So what we kind of came up with, the 3 of us, was We have the software and the hardware to be able to videotape all the interviews. A link for all board members to see at their leisure will be included in the minutes. I think that way no candidate running gets a sneak peek of the questions being asked. That's another thing that might be unfair. And that also kind of opens up an interview process to the full board.
Yeah,
Okay, well, if you're asking for input on this
Right.
process, if that's what you
Right.
want tonight, I don't think that that's a good workable situation. And I don't think that transcribing responses in written form is the same as hearing directly from the person. Even though I know there'll be an opportunity, but basically you are talking about going through.
No.
So where do the minutes come in? And I don't get this.
What we're suggesting is that all the interviews will be videotaped and sent to the board, but they won't be sent. So you'll be able to watch every interview as if you're in the room. We just are not going to give you access to it until all of the candidates for each individual office has been interviewed, to prevent people getting because the one thing that was very clear in Craig's resolution was that every candidate for each office will be asked the same questions. We don't want to release things and then people might be at a disadvantage if they're interviewed first, right?
Okay.
So there'll be no transcriptions. It will be a video you can watch.
I think you're risking, if that's the process that you all vote on and want, that's fine. I think you're risking full board participation. Once you're talking about a video that you have to go to and people have to be noticed as to when everybody is on it. And then I think it is way too complicated. I mean, I have a lot more to say about this, but I think you're making it more complicated than it should be. And I think the question of fairness is being interpreted in a way that, to be fair, everything has to be exactly the same. And fairness does not necessarily equal sameness. People have different personalities, different things to bring. Not all questions will be, even though it may be appropriate about hearing about the office, it may not be the best way for each candidate to shine, because they may have other things that they would like to bring in that would be helpful. And so I think it sounds too rigid to me. And even though you're going to get this within a couple of meetings, I still think it's too time consuming and too complicated. So, but thank you for listening.
Well,
Thanks, Michelle. Can we go to Sherry?
but remember one thing that even though people are asked the same questions, they have different takes and different answers, and people and the questions will be. I mean, I think you have to have some confidence that the committee will ask questions to try and elicit things from the candidates that they make sense for the board to know about, and the candidates will want to get in the points and show themselves that they ought to be shown in answering those questions. And so I think it'll work. That's my own view. But anyway, sorry, go ahead, Sherry.
First of all, I think since this is an internal procedure for rules, I do not believe the public should be participating in our discussion. I think it's totally inappropriate.
Well, can I just add, Sherry? I'm sorry about that. We have, under the
we
open
literally
meetings
have
law,
to, have to include them. What are you
right,
talking about?
under the open meetings law, we have to include the public. I mean, the public can, and so if they're here.
And it's at the discretion of the
participate.
co-chairs, of which I am one, to call on them first. So that's just.
Well, we always usually do that, but
Yeah.
I mean, but I don't think the committee though is going to take up a comment that they have to go get signatures from the public to run for board office.
All right.
Even though Boaz, I know, interesting suggestion.
It's a great,
Because Boaz is always very.
I agree.
Well, some
I
of
don't
the
think anybody's going to
suggestions
do
made
this.
were totally inappropriate. Secondly, I do not believe there should be nominations from the floor. This is the whole point of having this. Everybody it's not like everybody has a chance to throw their hat in. And if they choose not to do it during a specific time period, well, that's the process. So I would strongly recommend against nominations from the floor. I also would not recommend that you get questions from the board. There are ways to phrase questions which are pointed in to help or hinder a candidate. I frankly was subject to that when I ran for the board. So I think the question should all come from the election committee. And frankly, I think the responses should be written. I think each candidate the committee should come up with questions, then they should be submitted to each candidate, and each candidate should be required to do a written response, which is circulated to the board. That would save time. The other candidates would not know what their responses are, and I think that would solve a lot of the problem. I also think we should make a strong recommendation that this election process only starts when it really starts, and to ask candidates not to start campaigning in the summer. And if somebody calls you to ask for your support, the board member should say, I am sorry that the process hasn't started yet. I mean, the way that this operates is ridiculous. It should probably, people may have started already for the next election. I don't think there should be signatures for people running. I like the idea of the election. The election committee is really a facilitator, so I wouldn't give them a lot of, I don't see why they have to interview. I think the idea of, they come up with the questions, that's their role. Each candidate answers them, and then it's just submitted to the board, and the board can read them and see what the answers are. I think that's the cleanest way and quickest way to move along. Let me just see. Yeah, so those are really my points. No nominations from the floor, no interviews, and I think we'll have and you don't start campaigning until after you put your nomination in.
We can't really control that. But
I hear your concerns. Unfortunately, we're not really able to
exactly
control private conversations, so we can suggest that people think, but we can't.
As a board member, if you get a call from a candidate, you can say, I'm sorry, will not commit to you now until the process starts. I understand we can't control that, but you can change the culture. It's the culture that allows a person to start campaigning in the summer before the processes start. No, I understand that.
Yeah.
A much healthier way to do this.
But I might point out though, if you just have questions and then they're written out and you have written responses, there may be follow-up questions that make sense to try to elicit something that could be important that you lose out on, because then it's the much more sort of it's a more sterile process, I think.
I'm one of 3 people who have gone through our previous process who have actually been asked to submit written answers before. The secretaries last year were not given an interview, which was not the case. I don't want to be biased, but it's either it gives everyone more time to really think about what they want to say, or it also gives time to tailor what they want to say to what they think people want to hear. I do think there's a value in catching people off the cuff and not, giving time to prepare answers. I think also, some people might be a great board chair, but might be a horrible writer. That's something we should consider as well. The board chair is not responsible for writing minutes. They're not responsible. They actually are responsible for writing certain letters from the board, but they luckily have the assistance of a first vice chair and second vice chair. So.
They should be able to articulate an answer to a question. mean, we're all talking about intelligent English-speaking people, and I would imagine, and I think they can put an answer together. But again, that's up for the committee. I would go for, and also I would go for 5 members. I don't think you need 7.
Okay,
And
great.
or seven elected from 5 elected from among the board. And I don't feel strongly I guess I would think the board should elect the chair too, if we're trying to keep it as, transparent as, yeah.
That's what we talked about. And I think we should just let everyone say their initial comments. I think something like having the entire board elect the chair of that committee should be something that we can all express with a simple, raised hand vote. Same with kind of the number of people required for the committee. But we haven't heard from Ed.
Yep.
So let's turn to Ed.
Thanks, Rebecca. Sorry for the t-shirt back from the train. A little hot out there. So big surprise. I will be the contrarian here. I'm just gonna, all this complication at all levels is totally unnecessary. And frankly, listening to the legal arguments, contravention of each other. Okay, on the one hand, we say that we all have day jobs, which we do. Yet at the same by the same token, we're putting in place all these complicated mechanisms and machinations of interviews and questions. And good Lord, okay, this is just the community board. Okay, I know we get a lot of money for this, and I know we're looking for that big 6-figure raise this year from the borough president. But it's just, having observed elections and studied them for, I don't even want to say that number of years out loud in public, you all know it'll be a large number. Simplicity, simplicity, simplicity. One day we will not be in this horrible world of looking at each other on these screens, and we will actually be in person. I get on my knees every night and pray to whatever God there is that will come sooner than later. And a lot of these problems will dissipate. We need to talk to each other more than we do. That is an endemic problem in this country, in this city, and the way in which we analyze all our problems. And I think that this election process is just emblematic of the dysfunction that we have within this board. Look, it's very simple. People are going to campaign, and again, start campaigning the minute you get on the board. I don't care. I think it's great. Put everybody on the ballot. I don't think all this talk of, oh my God, if we open it up on the floor, 30 people are going to run for chair. Now, I can tell you right now, not a shot. If you're really running for chair, Sherry will know, people who've been chair, it is not an easy task. Okay, it is. Elite is nodding. So, I mean, anybody who wants to volunteer for this, I know the borough presidents tell the people who are elected chair, my sympathies and the congratulations at the same time. My point is, I don't think you're going to have a flood of people. I do think you should take nominations from the floor. And I would suggest very humbly that starting in September, you just throw it out there. Throw your hat in the ring. Okay? If you want to have this election committee and you want to winnow it down, then as a board, then submit a ton of questions to this election committee, okay? And then let them winnow it down to what they think are, like they do at these political forums. I know everybody on this call has been to these political forums, and you see it all the time. You submit your questions, and somebody's up there in an hour and a half, and 4 people ask kind of the same question. You winnow it down. So have that, and yes, they ask the same question. And to Michelle, your point, yeah, somebody goes first and somebody goes, yeah, his answer, and then I do that, and then they make the better one. Well, you avoid that problem by then the next time around, the next person goes. So just looking at my screen, it's Ed, Barbara, Elizabeth, and Sherry. So Ed goes first, and on the second question, Barbara goes first, and Ed goes last. And on the third question, Elizabeth goes first, and then Sherry, and on and on and on. So yes, Michelle, I understand your point, but it's mitigated. Again, I would just say, frankly, simplicity is do away with all these machinations and actually force us to actually talk to each other. How about that? We all talk to each other. We have to, please, Rebecca, if you let me. And so I would say that to that end, that you nominate people in September. They start campaigning whenever it is. Come October, you've got a list of questions. You let them get up there, do their thing in executive session. You give them 2 minutes to answer. They can figure it out. And then November, you vote. That's it. No more to it. It's very simple. It's very direct. It's very transparent. There's no need for extra committees and extra machinations and writings and all that. That is what I would support. Any other thing that involves committees, questions, confidentialities, looking at videos. I'm going to tell you right now, I'm going to vote no, Rebecca, on all of that. I would go for just simplicity all the way.
I sympathize with you. You wanted one thing. I wanted to keep what we had with improvements. Unfortunately, the full board voted to create the elections committee. So we're stuck. We have to fulfill our promise.
Right. So
I understand your concerns. I share them, but we need to come up with a new system tonight. So we need to make sure we focus our conversations on furthering that goal because we don't have another meeting.
Yeah, and that's also, I would say, a problem is that because we've waited now, okay, because we've been dilatory one way or another in getting to this topic until the summer, you now butt up against, the fall now, which is why I would say that you go with this simple solution in the interim, and then we get right on top of it in January if you want to have all these machinations.
Ed, wait a second. Ed, we voted on a resolution.
I understand that.
Our last board meeting, and it laid out a thing, and you're trying to relitigate. You're trying to relitigate all that, and we can't do it.
No, I'm not relitigating. What I would say, Chuck, is that you just.
Yes, you are.
Well, listen, relitigation is in the eye of the beholder. But my point is that for this election committee, I would say submit to them the questions, let them figure out what the common questions are for the rest of the board to listen to, and boom, that's it. That's all they need to do. So that's not relitigating.
Thank you.
So we're going to move on, but I will say you're entitled to vote no.
To state this, we actually did not bring this up for the first time this summer. This was on the agenda in our February meeting. We've been talking about this for actually months. So
boy, then that's really terrible that we haven't been able to in 6 months figure out anything.
It's apparently a hot topic. I don't know what to tell you.
I will say you can still vote no.
Yeah.
There's a chance even other people will vote no because they're uncomfortable with what we come up with. And this is an amendment to the bylaws. So to be honest, if we can't come up with a solution that will win the majority of the vote of the full board, we're just going to be stuck with what we had before. So let's
we can't be stuck with what we had before. We threw that out. We threw that out affirmatively. We did. Oh, yes, we did. We voted that out. We voted that out.
No.
Oh, yes, we did. Yes, we did. That is not up for question. That was voted out. Unequivocally, the nominating committee was tossed aside. We don't go back to that. That was affirmatively rejected by the full board. We don't go back to nominating committee. That definitely is not the case. No, that was prejudice.
My understanding. Well, we're going to move on. I want to make sure other people have a chance to talk. So we're going to call on Barbara.
Hi, I have a few comments. First, I'm very uncomfortable with the fact that we have to ask the same question to every candidate within the role that they're playing. I would ask a different question. First of all, I do watch forums, not just the local ones, but the others, and people much more experienced than any of us on the community board, in fact, ask different questions for based on their platform or their experience or why they're doing it. So certainly I would ask a different question for somebody that's running for the third time for secretary than somebody that was brand new and been part of the community board for a short time. I'm not saying this with a prejudice, but I think that we need separate questions. Number two, I don't know. I will say I haven't been to every meeting. I hope we're not saying that people can't make personal phone calls. As far as I'm concerned, good. I made my decisions because of people that called. And in one case, the persons that didn't call me, I had thought I would vote for somebody. I never got a phone call. And I said, obviously, they're not serious. That's number two. Number three, that this whole thing is going on. It's worked for years and years and years. I've been on the nominating committee a couple of times. It's worked for years and years and years. There's 1 year in particular that it was messed up. I was almost going to use a different word, but I won't. We're taped. That it was messed up, and we're going through this whole thing. And the fourth thing that I'm going to say that I hope isn't too contentious, but Chuck has not only been chair, but he's been on, I don't know if it's the longest of anybody on, but certainly very long. Every time he's gotten to speak and I've been ready to listen, he's been interrupted by the chairs, by everybody else. And I wish that Chuck had reasons to think, because I think he is a store of knowledge that would be able to phrase some of the things away. And I just wish that there was an interruption like that. I found it very frustrating, quite truthfully, because of it. But I hope that we have an open, and when people say, you know, it was terrible that somebody committed, I think on both sides, people have committed. People say I ran because so-and-so said I should run, and so on. And that's the natural way of doing it. I don't think anybody runs for any office if they don't feel that somebody's going to be in back of them. And I don't see where that's bad. I think that the personal conversations, questions that are tailored, whether I agree with what's said, whether it's from the community board, written or whatever, is very important. And I like hearing from people that have the experience and know for how many years has this really worked okay. I interviewed you, Rebecca. I know the process that went when we selected you and why, and it wasn't against, and we had a wonderful chair named Michelle, who was chair at the time, and it just worked. So that's my comment.
Yeah, I voted your way last time, so, but I'm just trying to make sure we come up with something new, because that's what the board wanted, despite my sentiments and agreements with what you said. Let's go to Elizabeth.
Barbara, I just wanted to say thanks for your comments, but I don't feel I'm being really interrupted. And I have great co-chairs.
Okay.
I have great co-chairs and others, and I don't have all the wisdom, and people should say what they want, and I'm always open for a good discussion. But thank you.
Much more diplomatic than I am, and I just like hearing what you say, because you have the history. I have a little bit of history. You have a load of history, and I think that
we have planning calls in advance of every committee meeting.
But we're not part of the planning calls.
Sure, but I'm just saying, like, we really do defer to Chuck on a lot of this, and we recognize and respect and are so grateful for his years of experience. So
don't make me feel any older than I am.
I think I'm older than you are, Chuck, so it's okay. 7 or 8 times I counted when I was waiting for Chuck to give the final sentence, and it was gone. So that it's just
it's a Zoom problem.
Right.
It's hard to see when someone's going to speak, so everyone wants to kind of go. So let's go to Elizabeth, and then we're going to go to Carolina. And then again, if you have a simple, like, let's make this committee 5 because we have to vote on a committee, I highly recommend making simple motions so we can start moving along. Let's go to Elizabeth.
Hi, I'm going to preface this by saying that I am in a car, and I am looking actually for a place to stop so that I can speak with kind of calmness. I think what I want to just reframe a little bit of what Ed was trying to suggest, which is I think that we are still in the phase of, in the construct of a nominating committee or an election committee as opposed to a nominating committee, our purpose is to figure out how this is going to work, and that we should not be wedded to what was in the original resolution or the original discussion that occurred at the board meeting. And I think the mandate was come up with an approach within this broad construct that would work. So within that, I would like to also weigh in that I think there is no reason for a nominating committee to hold individual interviews with candidates. And while providing the videos is a very lovely thing, I mean, if what we were really doing is we wanted to interview all the candidates, I would rather interview them all together. I think there is value in asking all of the candidates the same questions. Certainly when I worked in the city, a very standard part of all interview processes was a common set of questions so that you can more readily evaluate candidates on a common ground. I think there's value to that. I really like the suggestion of having the board submit questions to the nominating committee, the election committee, putting together a list of here are the most common questions and have everybody respond to the same common questions. But I think it should either be done in writing and sent around, and then allow board members to ask individual questions in a full board meeting in front of everybody. And if every candidate wants to answer the question, great. If every candidate does not feel the need to answer the question, I think that's okay too. I think there should be nominations from the floor, and I think the board can evaluate whether somebody who didn't go through the written questions in advance is worth their vote or not. There's no reason not to allow somebody to be nominated from the floor. And quite frankly, after seeing the written responses, people on the board may feel that we don't have the right candidate, and somebody may decide, you know what, it is the right time to step up. There should not be a barrier to that just because you didn't decide way back when. I think there's nothing wrong with a last minute candidate, and the board will vote. That's the value of the vote. You can decide that it was important to you, whether the candidate declared early enough to participate in the pre-process or not. So I would move to change the resolution as it relates to the election committee interviewing candidates, as well as allowing nominations from the floor.
Thanks,
Thanks.
Elizabeth. Carolina?
Hi there, guys. So just for clarification and for the point that Ed made, it was also my understanding that during the voting process in the last meeting, we did do away with the actual nominating committee.
We did.
Okay.
Yes, I think that's correct.
That's correct.
All right. So to that end, we have continued to discuss this nominating committee and interviews, et cetera. As somebody who was part of the last nominating committee, there were so many issues regarding once we came to the voting table, so to speak, there were members who were like, oh, I didn't know this person was running. And there was crying, which is insane for a group of adults, the community board to be happening. Therefore, I don't understand why we need these committees and the secrecy and the confidentiality, and now there's going to be a link. I mean, anyone who's been part of a sort of like a high school or a college election, it should be pretty straightforward. You say you're going to run, and for chair, which is, sort of the top position, give us the spiel, give us the 3-minute spiel. Maybe there's a common question if there's multiple people, but I don't think that there should be a nominating committee or any committee at that interviewing people who are looking to be secretaries. I mean, I'm not trying to take away from the position, but they take roll, they take minutes, they count votes. We took 10 hours interviewing people, and we actually had a pared down version for secretaries because we had 3 people running unopposed, obviously, for the 3 slots. I didn't see any value in me having to call Rebecca and anyone else in here and telling me all of this experience that they have when really the job didn't call for any of that. So we could literally sit during the second part of the meeting and say, look, here are your 3 minutes, give us your spiel. And if those folks want to go ahead and really rally people behind them, they can go ahead and make a phone call, write an email, I don't care. But I think we're taking so much time, committees and interviews and questions from the floor and videotapes. Like, it should not be this difficult for 50 people to choose a chair and a vice chair and a second chair and 3 secretaries. The fact that we're like in meeting number 3 discussing this, once the actual committee or the board said, hey, no nominating committee, is like, it blows my mind.
Yeah, no, I agree and I hear you. Unfortunately, the board did say they wanted an elections committee, so we really need to come up with an amendment to the bylaws, maybe not perfectly worded, to match what they said. Also, shout out to secretaries. It's actually a really hard job, and I think maybe one that should be considered more seriously when we pick people in the future. Let's go to Judy Schneider.
Okay, my thought is that we have the nominating committee. It puts together the questions, including questions submitted by the board. It gets all the people who want to put their name into nomination to run for an office by the October meeting. And the names are read out who are running for the board in October. They haven't been questioned, but they're running. And anyone else who feels they want to self-nominate or be nominated by someone besides those people who've put their name in can do it in the October meeting. Then I think the committee has between October and November to put the questions together. And now I'm going down a different road. At our November land use, instead of having a land use meeting, in November, the land use and full board should be at the full board. And the land use committee should be the nominating committees interviewing the various people at the committee live so the whole board can hear it. It's a mandatory attention at the time. Everybody must attend as the land use and full board, or this would be a mandatory meeting. And then in the next week, people would vote. That's just a suggestion.
Are you proposing an amendment to that effect, or are you just putting that on the table?
Well, if people are interested, I'd be happy to make that an amendment with any other little things that they want to add to it. I'd be happy to put that on the floor as an amendment. Anybody want to second that?
If there's a second, it will be on the floor. Anyone can still speak and respond. And Judy just said she would be open to friendly amendments, right? So you don't need to call to question if you want to continue the discussion, but let's see if that proposal is seconded. Please put a thumbs up virtually. I am not seeing a second.
Okay.
Ed Hartzog.
I had a question, Judy. It doesn't sound too dissimilar to what I was suggesting. I may second this if I have it correct. So this is why I'm asking the question for you, to you. As I understand it, so we come in September, you find out who's running.
No.
No, we don't find out in September. You don't put.
In September, you put the committee together.
Okay, we put this election committee together.
Right.
And they will screen the questions for the October, for November, you mean?
And in October, we ask before the October meeting, the land use full board, whichever, before the October meeting, anybody who wants to run for office has submitted their name and their bio.
If you would
And then at the October, let's say full board, the names will be read out to the full board. That first 7 people are running. Does anyone want to make a nomination from the floor or self-nominate themselves? That's the time to get the nomination from the floor in October.
Okay.
And then after that, the committee would then put the questions together and take any questions from the community board. And however the committee decides, they should go out in writing to the committee members, whatever details you want. I'm not putting in the details here. I'm putting in the dates. Then in the November, what would be a full board meeting would be a meeting of the whole committee. the whole board members, and they would listen to the chair or the committee of the nominating committee, present the questions or ask the questions to the chairs, to the first, second vice chairs, the secretaries, etc. And everybody would hear all the answers all at one time. There would be no need to send out stuff for people to read or spend other time. It would all be done at that meeting. And then at the full board, the next meeting, we would just vote on the members.
I
We
could
would
go
vote on the different positions.
Yeah, I could go with that. That doesn't sound
Okay,
too dissimilar.
before you,
That doesn't sound
before
too
you second-
dissimilar to what I was saying, Judy. I don't have a beef
Yeah.
with that at all.
before
I would
you second that.
I'm going to
Ed,
second that,
no,
actually,
just wait.
Rebecca.
Yeah, okay, I just want to, Chuck is our Robert's Rules expert. I want to make sure that that isn't too different from the resolution. And again, I mean, I've said this before, I think the bylaw is amendment based, so maybe we're entitled to come up with something new. I just want to turn it to Chuck in terms of what we're allowed.
Yeah, with all due
to
respect,
suggest
I do think it's
different.
certainly in order.
No, I'm just, he's the expert. So
I
We're
agree.
gonna defer.
Yeah, well, I have a little knowledge of it as
Yeah,
well.
he's
Yeah,
a lawyer, so I think we're good, but go ahead, Chuck.
Yeah, but look, I think it's in order.
Yeah,
Yeah.
it's in order. Thank you. Yes, I think so. Yeah.
And also, I would say, I didn't fill in any of the details. Anything you want to put in about the committee or the questions or whatever, I accept anybody's suggestions for I just gave you the outline. If you want to fill it in more,
Yeah,
go
I mean,
right ahead.
I guess since I'm signing on, I would just say that, when you do that, so everybody would submit the questions to the committee. You have this election committee. Yeah, I mean, I don't see, and they can figure it out. I don't know if we need to, I mean, I'm hesitant to add more to the process for two reasons. One, I've heard consistently from people who have been on this committee, and I would not use names, but some of the people are on this call. And I've heard consistently, because no one's on this committee year after year over year, that every year it's different. Okay, so there's no book that tells you how to do it. So this is why I'm very adamant about simplicity, and why I like your suggestion, Judy, because simplicity, because that way you don't have to do all this year to year, all this machinations. You can just look at it and it's pretty self-explanatory. So I mean, that's why I'm signing on. I'll be quiet, but that's my view on the piece.
So Ed did second it. I raised my hand because I'm going to speak not as a chair. I'm just simply never going to vote in favor of something that takes away from public time. I liked where you were going. I'm not comfortable in submitting an entire land use meeting when we might have applications and might want to hear from the public to deal with internal board business.
Well,
So-
then it doesn't,
No.
it doesn't, I will revise it doesn't have to be at the land use. It could be the first Wednesday of the month, like we're meeting now, instead of having transportation. But my point was that it would be a required meeting of the full board. Once a year, it would be a required meeting of the full board. And I don't care what day you pick.
Yeah, no, that's fine. I'm not going to say more. That's my big concern. I think it's crazy that we have to spend so much time on internal business when we're a public agency, and I'm just not going to vote in favor of something that does it that way.
Okay, I think we
Now,
can move on. You
maybe-
made that really clear, Rebecca. Can we unmute Alita? She had
Alita.
something to say.
Thanks. I had a couple of questions. One is that, and if I missed this, my apologies, Judy, did you specify how many committee members there are
No, she didn't say it.
and how they're selected? I think that would be important.
No, I just gave a broad outline of how we do the voting. You folks fill in all the rest. I'm happy with what the board decides.
Okay, and will there still be speeches by the candidates the night of the election?
Whatever you decide, if you want questions, if you want speeches, but whatever you
Well,
decide.
No, I don't think there'd be questions, but speeches. I think there'd still be speeches the way we always had it, because the questions and answers would have been done at the previous meeting.
Right, yeah, no, that's what I was thinking. I just wanted to be sure. And last, I'd just like to say that having served as chair, and I don't know if you would agree, Chuck, there have been some comments that it's relatively insignificant, the board elections. And I have to say that working as chair was a very time consuming, as Ed pointed out, position with an awful lot of responsibility. And it's while it's not the same as a public discussion on the issues that we have, it certainly is important in terms of running of the board and shouldn't be minimized in any way, not just for the people who give their great amounts of time to serving in that capacity, but also because of the great responsibility that we shoulder in a lot of different ways. So I just wanted to end with that, and I appreciate everyone listening. Thank you.
Yeah, no, I agree with Alita. It's a big time commitment. There's a lot of responsibility. We give our board chair, we always have a lot of authority and support the board chair in that, but the board chair has a lot to do.
Thank you.
Gail?
I think number one, that 5 would be the ideal number. You need an odd number, but I certainly don't think you need 7 people to serve on the elections committee. I also like the idea of questions being asked in November and then the speeches in October, the speeches in November, and then the vote. I think you definitely want to have the candidates have that opportunity. We can determine if it's 2 minutes or 3 minutes, but you want to hear how they speak and what their real passion is. And you get that a lot more from just listening to them when they do give those speeches. And I think many of us have been swayed by certain candidates just based on the way in which they have presented their passion and their views. I certainly think that the elections committee should vet the questions. I like the idea of having questions submitted from the entire board. I think that that's really very positive. But overall, I think the elections committee should also look, has somebody done something egregious? I mean, for the most part, you've got 50 people on this community board, all of whom have tremendous skills and very solid backgrounds. So how many people are you going to say are not really qualified to run for a particular office? And you want to encourage participation, particularly since we do have term limits. I think that that's something else that we shouldn't forget about. So I don't think you're going to have 5 people, as Ed says, who throws their hat in the ring to be chair, or that many people who are going to be running for each office. But if we can get questions vetted by the elections committee, from the entire board, and I agree with Elizabeth Rose and others, I think that in most interview processes, yes, you may sometimes in a corporate or a government setting kind of have a follow-up question, Chuck, but for the most part, you ask the same questions and you see how the candidate answers. So if we have questions vetted, if we have a 5-member elections committee, if we go through the voting for the elections committee by the entire board, where normally for almost every other committee, obviously the chair makes that determination. I think with the thought of transparency, let's let the entire board start by electing certainly the members. And if we want to go one step further, we can also ask that the chair be elected from within those 5 that were just elected, or whoever gets the largest number of votes, however we want to do it. But I think that's how we kind of hone in to the point that people will think that we are being transparent, because I think we all have the same goal. We want the best candidates to run for the office, and we want to elect those people who will best serve the community board at large. Thank you.
Thank you.
Gail, I think you articulated a lot of things that make sense, and maybe that's the kind, maybe that we could use that as a basis of a resolution to at least move a number of these things forward.
Okay.
I don't think we have the time to vote on another resolution, so I hope what we vote on will be the amendment. I will say from my research, if this is what this committee is deciding to do, one board did have in their bylaws that they mandated a special meeting of the board to conduct the very, the question asking that Judy kind of was talking about. So I would suggest someone might, if that's what they're interested in, put that forth. And personally, I would just say also maybe make it a set date of the month, like we do for other things. But every November, right? There's a day where we conduct this, because I do think we want to make a process that will stand the test of time. And I think being clear on dates is something that's important. So let's go to
Gail.
Alita.
Can I just ask Gail one? Were you saying that the questions and answers would be given in front of the whole board? Was that what you were saying when you were making that discussion? Or were you saying that the committee would interview those people separately?
No, in front of the entire board.
Okay, so you were basically laying out a thing that Ed and Judy talked about. I just want to make that clear. Okay. So
Alita?
it's Alita, I guess, Alita, yeah.
And just in terms of the actual election mechanics, I'd like to include in any resolution, I don't know how to do this properly, that the chair of the election committee conduct the election in terms of selecting the order that the candidates will speak and what to do if they run over the time allotted to them, that kind of thing.
Yeah, I think you're right, Alita. I think that's what was intended to, and that would be part of a resolution.
Right. It just should be included, I think. Thank you.
So should we vote on,
Yeah, I think we should.
Gail laid out a number of things and I think that 5-member committee and the committee vet gets questions from the board and vet questions and answers be conducted at a special, board meeting and that kind of, those are the kinds of things that we're talking about. Judy, did you want to say something on that?
Yeah, that's pretty much what I'm saying, but I think we need to put dates in there that, months, okay? That the people have to submit their nomination by the full board meeting in October. Yes. And the questions have to be submitted by a certain date and given out to the people who are running for. I think everything needs to be a date, whether it's like what we do, the second Wednesday, the third Tuesday, however you want to, whatever dates you want to pick. But when we go back to the full board, I think every part of the action needs to have a date in it.
Right, I agree.
Can I suggest that we vote on what, you initially proposed and decide as a committee, we will vote on dates after, just so we kind of don't delay the conversation.
But we can come up with the dates. I think we can come up with the dates if something passes that says we're going to follow this procedure. I think we'll be able to come up with the dates.
Okay, so is Will gonna run this vote or?
No.
Somebody call the question.
Well, I thought that
people still want to speak. Let Ed.
Okay, sorry, Ed.
Ed and Cost hasn't spoken yet. Why don't we let Cost speak and then Ed can speak
I was going to
again,
say,
and
hopefully,
Elizabeth.
Cost. I was going to.
I'm going to take a wild bet that Cost is going to call to questions.
Yeah. I was going to say, so I was going to help him out here, so we don't have to have 2 votes. And Judy, if you are okay with this friendly amendment, I would say I put in the dates for you because I think we're on the same page. And whether you want to, it's October and then we do the November thing. So look, if you want to make it consistent on dates and not picking Wednesdays, how about just you want to say October 15th? Or
well,
that might be too late.
The October part, I think the chair should be during the full board announcing who's running for office and do we have any nominations?
Right.
So the full board.
Apparently, we're taking nominations from the floor, which I didn't know. But anyway, if that's what you want to do.
Ed, I think, one second. I think the procedure would be September, we have the elections committee that's chosen. And that's number one. Then October, between that time, all the candidates submit their names to the board and the elections committee. At the October meeting, the chair of the elections committee will say, all right, these are the candidates who have now submitted their names. and if we're going to have nominations from the floor, then at that point, people can have nominations from the floor. And then there's another meeting that would probably be at the beginning of November, where the questions that have been submitted to the elections committee and vetted by that will be asked by the elections committee of all the candidates, and they will answer those questions in front of the full board at that meeting. And then at the full board meeting of November, there'll be a vote. There'll be speeches by the candidates, all that process run by the chair of the elections committee. And there'll be speeches by the candidates, and then we'll vote. I think that's,
The only thing I would add, Chuck, the only thing I would add to that is that the meeting in November, where the elections committee is asking the questions or whatever it is they're doing, that's a mandatory meeting of the whole board.
Which is
Yeah, be a
which is
full
why I
board-
think
a
you
full
had the
board
land
meeting,
use,
Judy.
which is why I think
Pardon?
you wanted, which is why I thought you wanted to have it at land use, because that's required.
That's why I
for-
wanted to have it
I
at the
would-
land use.
I would go along with that. personally.
And Rebecca, having it at land use, very often we have land use and full board combined. And in November, that would just happen unless we've had some major, huge project that needed its own meeting, which we would just have to schedule a separate meeting.
And honestly.
Yeah, no, I will just say, sorry, I lost audio for a little while, so I actually missed a lot of what Chuck said. My hesitation on that, it's personal. I was very embarrassed by the fact that we spent 3 hours conducting an election when our duty is to serve the public. You know, I don't think we should use a designated public meeting to further internal
Well,
business.
then pick
that I really
another
don't
day.
think should be that complicated.
Well, fine, we
Pick
can go
the
into
first
executive.
Wednesday of the month.
How about
Chuck,
this?
I'm sure you'd be glad to move your transportation in November.
How,
Pick the first Wednesday of the month.
Judy, how about this as an amendment, maybe to come with a compromise? Chuck, what do you think of this? Is that we keep it at the land use in November? Okay, because I think a lot of us who've been on the board a long period of time know that November and December, like you said, unless the mayor has some special pet project at the end of the year, we usually don't have it. But this is, look, we do it in land use, and hey, we signed up for this, gang. So you go to executive session. You have it at land use. We don't take the public's time. You go to executive session. Listen, you're on the board. You made the sacrifice. If you don't want to do it in public, that's fine. I appreciate that. But why add another requirement for the board members for a third meeting in November if you're going to have that land use? And then just put it at the back end of land use and do an executive meeting like we do when we do the budget committee, right? We do that.
Yeah, no, I think that makes, that I agree.
I agree.
You know, I think we all commit to be available,
Right.
the second and third when, and in my, in other, and committees, in my case, 3 Wednesdays, the first, second, and third Wednesdays.
Right.
And I think that, and a lot of times we don't have land use issues. And if we do, they can be pushed to the full board sometimes too.
Yeah, and I actually like. I
Yeah,
actually think.
I think
I
there's
actually think. I worry about actually adding an additional mandatory meeting. You know, like
Right.
I would just rather it be sort of when you're appointed, you sort of look at the schedule. You know what your commitment is. At least it's something that we've all sort of agreed on. And I wouldn't want to create this sort of special board meeting that people then may not be able to attend. I feel like that's. I think we're trying to solve for. Like making this a more democratic, inclusive, participatory process. And so I do think actually including it, look, I think at the end of the day, you know, Rebecca, I think there's a lot of stuff we probably waste the public's time on at these meetings. So
That's for sure.
I
Said that, not me.
agree to disagree. That's just my personal
That's
opinion.
fine. That's
I
fine.
was embarrassed
Okay.
about what we did last
Everybody
time.
was.
I'm worried about
Everybody
everything.
was. Everybody
Can we
was.
get any
You'll get
last
over it.
minute?
You'll get over that.
Can we get any last minute comments before we vote on this?
Let's call on cause. He might be calling a question, but he hasn't spoken, so he is entitled to.
Yeah, before I call the question, can I take bets on my calling the question?
No betting, no gambling allowed.
Call the question.
It's actually legal in New York now, but anyway.
Okay, so,
Okay, we have
okay, is there a second for
There
that?
is from
Calling question, Judy?
I think that is
second
from Judy and Elizabeth,
Okay.
and yep.
Well, maybe Will should call the roll, and so we have all the people here, all the board members here.
Okay, so I'm going to lower the
Yeah.
hands, and then I'm just going to go in order of the board members as I see them, and then
Sure.
add the co-chairs at the end, so they will get to vote last,
Sure.
as we usually do
Sure.
for landmarks and some of our other committees.
Thank you, Will.
So I just want to make sure you guys don't need to declare what we're voting on before I call the roll.
No,
A yes is a yes.
I think we
Okay.
summed them all up. Yeah, the
Good.
yes is yes, right?
All right, good. So Alita Camp,
Yes.
thank you. And if you guys don't mind muting yourselves back as soon as you're done. Carolina Tejo,
Pass.
was that a pass?
Yes.
I think.
Okay,
yes,
thank
yeah.
you. Cause Spagnoletti,
Yes.
that was a pass as well. Okay.
Oh, no, he said yes. I think he
Yes.
said yes.
Okay. Thank you. See. Ed Hartzog.
Yes.
Thank you, Ed. Elizabeth Rose.
Yes, and I have something I want to discuss after the vote.
Yeah, okay, after the vote. Okay.
All right. Gail Barron.
Yes.
Thank you. Jane Parshall. Jane, just go ahead and unmute. Jane, we can't hear you. You're not.
Yeah.
Yes.
Yes, Jane.
Thank you. Judy Schneider.
Yes.
Thank you, Judy. Lori Boris.
Yes.
Thank you, Lori. Michelle Birnbaum.
Yes.
Thank you, Michelle. And Sherry Weiner.
Abstain.
Abstain. Thank you. Then Chuck.
Yes.
And then Taina.
Yes.
And then Rebecca.
No.
And we'll come back to Carolina Tejo.
I'm gonna abstain.
Thanks. So that passes. I don't know the exact vote.
I saw,
I can get that
I
for
think
you
it was
in 1 second.
11, 1, 2, but if you could confirm.
Yeah, I think it was a useful discussion, Judy. Appreciate your thought. It was an interest, you know, we struggled with how to deal with the questions and stuff. And
Chuck, really quickly, sorry. Michelle, you needed to change your vote.
Oh, sorry.
To abstain.
Don't want to vote? I'm sorry.
Abstain.
Okay, thank you, Michelle.
Okay. Did we get all
Can we
the
call on
board
Elizabeth
members?
Rose?
Yeah, she voted yes.
No. She wanted, she couldn't speak during her vote, but we haven't.
We'll call on her again. Chuck was just saying something. I think, yeah, then we can go to her.
Yeah,
I
did
interrupted you,
we,
Chuck, sorry.
do we have everybody, Will, now?
Yes, that was everybody.
Okay. Yeah, I think that did pass. And thanks, everybody, for a good discussion, interesting discussion, and I think some good thoughts. Elizabeth, I know, wanted to say something further, and she did it the right way. She didn't try to make a speech during her vote.
We appreciate you, Elizabeth.
Okay. Can we recognize Elizabeth? then?
Thank you. And I have now pulled over onto a
Uh-oh.
shoulder of the road, so I can actually, again, give you guys the full attention. So first of all, I also agree that was a really useful conversation and discussion, and we ended up somewhere different than we started. So thank you to everybody for that. Now you hear the dogs barking because they don't like it when the car stops. I would like to propose maybe the right word for it. One other change to the election process, because I think we've got here is a really good outline for a process. My only concern is that the interview process could take multiple hours, and that's something that the election committee is going to have to really manage to make sure that there is an appropriate number of questions and amount of time given to each of the offices. So towards that end, I would like to propose that rather than having two separate elections for the first vice chair and the second vice chair, that we have a single pool of candidates run for vice chair, and that the person who gets the most votes become the first vice chair, and the person who gets the second most votes becomes the second vice chair. And so it be a single election for vice chair rather than two separate elections.
Are you proposing that as an amendment?
I am proposing that as an amendment.
Is there a second to that? Let's see if there's a second first to that. Judy second. Judy seconds that. Okay. And do people want to discuss that at this point? Yeah. Rebecca, go ahead. You wanted to.
Yeah, I raised my hand because I'm not speaking as chair for this. I think they're two different roles. And so I do think we should enable people to run for those offices separately. One is much more about being a second hand, I believe, to the chair, and one is more about, doing the grunt work and being the backup. And we don't have a first vice chair, and I can testify I've done quite a bit of that grunt work, and I think someone who wants to do that work should be able to run for the office that requires. I think maybe we don't have enough clarity about what each of those roles are, and maybe that's the confusion, but my interpretation has been that they're distinct offices. All right, let's call on Ed.
Yeah, thanks. Yeah, I agree with that. I think there are two different roles, and I think if you're going to do what Elizabeth suggested, then I think you need to kind of rejigger some of the bylaws to fit that, because I do think you do run for, it's two entirely different roles. One is there to take over and the other one is not. So I think the members should be clear, because I personally believe, and again, just personal, my view is that I think that, when you're ascending to that kind of leadership position, that you need to have been on this board for a while to understand the dynamic of everything that comes with that. And there's a lot of angles that come, not only knowing the 50 members of this board, but knowing all the players that come to this board, which is a lot of big folk. And I would want to know, who's going to be the first vice chair on that score in case of the chair. That's all.
Thanks. Alita?
All right, let's go to Alita.
Thanks. I think they are different roles, and someone who would like to be first vice chair might not want to be second, and vice versa for different reasons. So anyone who applies to be vice chair under Elizabeth's strategy would need to give consent to be nominated for both, or to take on either position. And then what happens if someone doesn't want either position and only wants first vice chair or second, and gets votes that would put them in the other category? Or how do you work that out with someone who would be willing to take on either position? So that's my question. Thank you.
Thanks, Gail.
I agree with both Ed and Alita. They really are two separate positions. And I think you may be fortunate enough to have a second vice chair who could easily serve as first vice chair or as chair of the board. But I do believe that your first vice chair, having been Alita's for 3 years, serves a different function and is there not just as part of the brainstorming opportunity, but as importantly, able to go and speak on behalf of the chair, go to borough board meetings. It's not to, and then the second vice chair obviously would do so if the first vice chair couldn't. The second vice chair also is an opportunity for somebody who may well be a little newer to the board and might want to be in the leadership category and is willing to say, well, I'd like to be second vice chair and work my way up to first vice chair and perhaps to chair. So I think it can be a growth and a learning experience as well. So I understand the whole question about time consumption, but I would certainly hate to kind of put both of those positions together just with the thought, well, let's do it to save time, because I think that your officers are very important. Thanks.
I think we can also have a further meeting to maybe talk about the roles of the office in the future if the committee votes not to change how we vote on things, because I think that's an important discussion. I think we have, as a committee, maybe not been following up on kind of all of our other duties as a rules, right, committee as well. Let's go to Judy.
Yeah, I think that I agree with Elizabeth Rose and not the prior speakers, because I think if people are told up front that they're running for either first or second vice chair, then they know what it is that is expected of them. Because after all, Tricia left. We don't have a first chair. We have a second vice chair, which is Valerie. If for any reason Russell needs help, I'm sure he is perfectly capable, and Valerie is capable of filling out the duty of first vice chair. Or for some reason, if Russell can't attend a meeting and Valerie has to conduct a meeting, I think that would work out fine. I think whoever we vote for either of these positions needs to be strong enough so the possibility of their going forward, even as chair, is a possibility. And if we were to make this change that Elizabeth is suggesting, I think it needs to be fully explained to the board members so they understand what's expected of them before they would run for these positions. So that's just my point of view, and I'm in agreement with Elizabeth.
All right, Kaz?
After hearing the pros and cons, I move to table this till next year.
Okay.
Okay.
I mean, we can't.
Second from
You want
Ed.
to move? Is there a second to that? Yeah, Ed seconded it.
From
Okay.
Ed.
Did you mean just table at this point? Move the table?
Well, I don't think we should be discussing it now. We voted on the
Okay.
on what we're going to
Well,
do.
I think you mean, don't you mean to, you move to table? Because if you move to table to next year, that's a different motion than just moving the table.
Can we unmute Ed Hartzog?
Is there is a second, right? To
Right,
that?
but I think he wants to explain.
Tell me-
Seconded.
Tell me,
I
Thank you. Yes, I seconded Kaz's first suggestion to table this until, Kaz, if I may, till January of 2023, I think is what he was suggesting. I was seconding that motion to table. Absolutely.
Okay. But
Absolutely.
no, right. No, I understand that. Okay, so that's the motion.
Yeah.
That's still a debatable motion. So does anyone want to comment further on that?
Put my hand up.
Yeah.
Elizabeth.
Put my hand up.
Then I call the question.
Okay.
I think we
Is there a
have
second to
call
calling the
on
question?
Elizabeth
Is there?
before we call back on him. He already
Yeah.
did one motion. I don't think you can do
That's
two
true.
in a row.
Well, we had an interruption, but that's all right. But let's have Elizabeth Rhodes, I agree, speak. Go ahead, Elizabeth.
Am I unmuted?
Yes.
Oh, okay. I didn't have to push a button. So I think the issues that are being raised are important ones, which is, what are the distinctions in those two roles? I do not think that the distinctions in the roles are apparent. So I am open to this should be discussed further. To address Gail's con of, second vice chair is a way for a younger person to take on a leadership role and, in effect, begin to work their way up, I think that kind of thing would naturally come out of a vote that was either a, in order, the number of people who vote for you, if somebody's less well known, they will get fewer votes. Or an alternative could be to do a ranked choice voting of some variety, which we know our city has embraced, to end with effectively a single voting process for what at the moment appear to be two very similar jobs. So it does sound like greater understanding and clarity on what the distinctions are might be helpful. But there may still be ways of conducting an election or voting such that the interview process could either all be done at once, or that can be done in a much more efficient manner than doing two completely separate elections. So I'm not opposed to the tabling this. I do think it's worth further discussion.
You can also withdraw if you're comfortable with tabling it since you proposed it, and I can promise you that we will address this and other election issues at a further time.
Yes, we will bring it up, absolutely.
That's fine.
Thanks.
So-
Okay, so the motion was withdrawn. Alita.
Well, I'm glad the motion was withdrawn because there are a lot of changes here, and to throw something else into the mix would just be too much, I think, for everyone to figure out if it didn't work, what about it didn't work. So I think it's a good idea, or an interesting idea and merits full discussion. So I'm all for that. But this is all entirely moot since it's been put away. So thank you all. Guys, the ideas and the discussion has been notably civil and courteous and creative. So I'm all in support of that. Thank you.
Thanks, Alita. Judy?
Yes, I have an issue. I spoke to Chuck briefly today about it that I'd like to bring up in a future meeting after we get all the selection stuff done. And it has to do with the number of public members that can be appointed to a committee. So would you please put that on your list of discussions for future meetings?
Yes, I think especially since you're going to have people rotating off the board, and it might be useful to have some people who rotate off the board be made public members. So it's absolutely worthy of discussion, Judy.
Just
So-
out of curiosity.
And I just want to say, this all came to me after listening to Jane Parshall's wonderful interview. If people haven't seen it, that Monica McCain did of her, I watched it today, and it was just terrific. And when she was talking about board members, it made me think that we need to do something about the public members and losing our institutional memory.
Yeah, I will also just say, this is something, if you're interested in this idea, other boards have done it. It's actually shifted their election months. I didn't want to bring it up when we were deciding what we're going to do about this, but they shifted it to align with term limits to enable, people to get their, fulfill the office for the entire length that they wanted to. That's something we might need to raise in the future. So if that's something of interest, please reach out to the co-chairs as well. Ed?
Move to adjourn.
Is there a second to that? That's non-debatable.
Yes, thank you.
Non-debatable. So I think is there any objection, basically? I don't think so. So I appreciate it. And I believe we are adjourned. And thanks everybody for all your help and thoughtfulness.
Thanks,
Take
Chuck.
care.
Have a